Hello, my name is Jim Robb, and I'm president of the National Training and Simulation Association, otherwise known as NTSA. For those new to NTSA, we're a nonprofit association dedicated to facilitating dialogue between government, industry, academia, on topics related to providing the best possible training and training systems for our warfighters, first responders, and their families. We host a portfolio of 9 events each year, the last of which is IITSEC, the largest training and simulation conference dedicated to the defense area of its kind in the world. So please come and look at iitsec.org for further information. Today's discussion is really relevant given all the current scenarios out there, and we'll discuss cybersecurity. I think we all know how vulnerable we've been and how we have been attacked before, and how we need to get better. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. So I look forward to hearing today's presenters and hopefully learning something, and I'm sure I will. Following the panel's opening remarks, our speakers will answer the questions you provide in advance and attempt to address those that are coming through the system live. The webinar is scheduled for an hour, and we will respect the time for all involved and most likely adhere to that. So let me now introduce our 2 speakers. First is Joe Hughes, who's the Vice President, Supply Chain Risk Management of Fortress Information Security. Joe is a recognized leader with over 19 years of experience in cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. For over 7 years, Joe led the third-party risk management program at General Electric, obviously one of the largest global suppliers in the energy and manufacturing industries. Additionally, we have Andrea Schoeman, who's the Director of Federal Partnerships and Programs for Fortress Information Security as well. Andrea has a background in working with federal programs as well as cybersecurity inspection and compliance, which I know is of great interest to all of you out there. As an experienced business intelligence analyst, she has a demonstrated history of process improvement and performance to drive revenues and achieve program and operational goals. So now I'll get off the stage and turn it over to our dynamic duo. Over to you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the introduction. So before we get started this morning, we'd just like to say thank you to the NTSA for allowing us to participate in today's webinar. And we hope that you find it really engaging and interesting. We do have a slide deck prepared for you. It can be accessed via the handouts, so you don't have to worry about furiously taking notes as we present today. But we do want it to be engaging. So feel free to use the Q&A section to ask questions as we go through the presentation this morning. We'll try to address them in real time if they're relevant to the slide that we're showing. If you're not sure and you need a minute to mull over the information, then please we'll have time at the end of the presentation as well to have more of an open discussion and answer questions. So I'm not going to go back into our introductions. Admiral Robb did a great job of introducing us. Thank you very much. And so as you registered for today's webinar, registrants had the opportunity to submit questions in advance. We're going to address a couple right up front. And then, like I said, we'll go through the presentation and address those as we have the content available on the slides. So first, the first question we got was who is responsible for managing risk? And what we want to say is everyone. This is a problem that extends across all levels and departments within an organization. And so we'll refer back to the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack as a prime example of this. In May 2021, Colonial Pipeline experienced an extensive ransomware cyber attack that was believed to be the result of a breached password, allowing a bad actor to gain access to the VPN. So while it's typical to think that this would be part of the IT or CISO's responsibility, this actually was an attack on the billing system. And as it rolled out across the ecosystem, it left Colonial Pipeline unable to bill customers and, more importantly, to meter the usage. So they had no way to track outflow from the pipeline themselves. And so that resulted in them needing to shut everything down. So it resulted in fuel shortages and panic buying across 5 states, which then led to a surge in fuel prices. And then fuel shortages led to a halt of activity at an international airport. Then it led to a declaration of a state of emergency just 2 days later. This resulted in an executive order being issued, increasing software security standards, but it still left Colonial Pipeline in the dark as to how much data was lost and the true impact. And so when you talk about responsibility for risk management, it's not isolated to one player or one department or one team within an organization. It really is the responsibility of the entire organization to be mindful of best practices and the potential risk or the potential outfall of risk. So the other question that we received is, how do you manage risk from third parties? So if you submitted this when you were registering for the webinar, this is for you. And I am going to turn it over to Joe to spend the next 45 minutes or so answering this question for you. Joe?
Thank you, Andrea. So that's a very great question. And, as Andrea highlighted with the Colonial Pipeline attack, cybersecurity risk management is no longer just an IT or a cyber concern. And as we see cyber attacks and events such as the Colonial Pipeline attack, or the most recent one for Okta that is in the news today, or the last couple of days, supply chains are key at threat vectors into your organization. And historically, most organizations have spent a lot of time and money and analysis protecting what's within their boundary. I know when I was at GE, if I looked at our cyber budget and our overall, business organizations budgets, the vast majority of it was focused on, protecting our enterprise. How do we protect, do we have all these safeguards in place? Do we put like the guardrails up in certain areas? And before I started, very few or not a lot of focus was on the third parties. So as you transfer data, as you transfer information outside of your organization to a third party organization, the risk of that goes with it. And at the same time, you need to be concerned about, how are they protecting that data, and are they protecting it at the same level that you are? So really today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is third-party risk management. How do we mature our third-party risk management organization, what that really looks like. And we have something that I've kind of learned from experience, and I interpret it as there are really 6 pillars that you have to consider when you are evaluating your third-party risk management program. And so we'll go through all that, but I felt like we should probably start with a definition of what is third-party risk management. And, if, depending on who you talk to, there are a lot of terms out there that, some people use as synonyms, and then some people, if you talk to them, there are distinct differentiations between them. So you hear the term supply chain risk management, you hear the term vendor risk management, but really what they is a different way to talk about our third-party ecosystem. And third-party risk management is really the processes that you use to manage the risk of your third-party, fourth-party, fifth-party, your supply chain ecosystem. And it's much more than just cyber and IT risk. I think at a lot of organizations, certainly when I was at GE, and this is where we started, it was very focused on cyber and IT risk. But in reality, there's so much more risk that you need to evaluate, whether that's financial risk, your corporate social responsibility, performance and contract. But the big one, and Colonial Pipeline, highlighted that as well, is your business resiliency. Impacts to your supply chain are going to impact, the business resiliency. And so really third-party risk management holistically is, how do you evaluate that risk, and how do you mitigate it? How do you manage it at an acceptable level? And we all know, and we'll talk a little bit, especially at the end, about all the compliance regulations, what's there now and what's coming down the pipeline. Clearly, third-party risk has got everyone's attention, as you'll see by the number of regulations that are coming or that are currently here that are talking or touching that. But it's a very important area. And so let's dig a little bit deeper. So I like to be transparent and know that when you're implementing a third-party risk management program at an enterprise level, there's going to be a number of key challenges that you're going to have to go through. And so as we talk a little bit today, I'll address some of these key challenges as we go through each section. But really, number one is the consistency to the approach at your organization. So depending on the size of the organization, depending on how complex it is, depending on how regulated that organization is, that'll all add to the complexity of your risk management approach. And the key to it is being consistent. You know that there might be some operating units that have unique circumstances, but across the board, having that consistency will allow you to address risks as they come in a consistent manner. We've hit on this point a couple times, but there are so many numerous stakeholders in your third-party risk management ecosystem. So certainly IT and cybersecurity, but also, the business units, your procurement organizations, your risk management teams, your legal teams, down to the day-to-day folks who are using, these third parties to do their jobs, all could be impacted if there is a resiliency issue with your suppliers, or if there's some kind of supply chain incident. So keep that in mind, is that, this is one of those areas that is much bigger than just cybersecurity. It involves all stakeholders in your business. And that's why it's best viewed as like a top-down approach that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Resource constraints, most organizations don't have unlimited money. So you have to prioritize, you have to, get the most bang for your buck while meeting your compliance and regulatory requirements, which is the next one. So, having a good idea of your industry, your operations, what are those regulatory requirements, that'll really allow you to prioritize and evaluate what are, the priority resources you need on an ongoing basis. The second, or the next item here, is obtaining value from the program. So yes, it's important to be in compliance, but compliance is really only a small portion of your third-party risk program. When we talk about, some concepts like getting executive buy-in or leadership buy-in, the best way to do that is to show how you're going to get value from the data that you're gathering from this program. So, the goal from your third-party risk management program is to get actionable data that you can use to make business decisions. And that's how you're going to demonstrate value, by also showing that by doing so, you're also in compliance with your regulatory requirements. And some other challenges, certainly if you have a global, and we dealt with this at GE a lot, having a global manufacturing and supply chain. We see now with, the incidents going on within Russia and Ukraine, global incidents can impact the supply chain. So you have to monitor those and understand where your suppliers and where your supply chain is located. And that's very important. We'll talk on that in a little bit. And just, for most organizations, you have a large number of vendors and products. And it's important to understand what they are, but very few organizations do this at all, let alone very well, that they have a good understanding of their third-party risk management ecosystem. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But if I'll start with one of my key takeaways is the first thing you need to do is kind of understand what your supplier ecosystem is. Understand the number of vendors you have, what they do, what products they're producing for you, and gather that understanding. Because if you don't have that, it's going to be hard to focus your program and get the most value for, the time and money spent on that. So just a reminder, as we go through here, if you'd like to add or ask questions at any point, please put them in chat. If not, I will keep talking. And as Andrea can attest, I can talk for a long time. So
that's right. We're both a couple of talkers. I'll be monitoring the Q&A box. As you enter a question, you may not see it right away. We're going to answer or do our best to answer them in real time, and then I'll publish them so that you see it. So if you've entered a question and you haven't seen it yet, it doesn't mean that it wasn't received. I'll also remind you if there's anything laggy or buggy, refresh your browser, and that should correct that as well. All right, Joe.
Perfect.
No questions so far.
Great. So, this is, as I've talked a little bit about your third-party risk management program, it's important to note that there's different levels of maturity when it comes to a third-party risk management program. So the good news is everyone's going to be able to take this handout with them. But really, if we look at it, we see there's like really 4 levels of maturity when looking at a third-party risk management program. So, starting on the left, which is the least mature, really that's just a lack of a non-existent program, right? This is, and probably most organizations on the call today are not in this bucket. But even through work that we've done recently, we're still, finding and identifying organizations that really have not prioritized their supply chain risk management. So they don't have a compliance program. As I mentioned, they don't have that documented list of vendors, let alone knowing what the vendors do. They just don't know what their total number and list of vendors are. And I'll use vendors and suppliers as synonyms as I talk through this, but I know there are slight differences in them. But for the purpose of this high level presentation, we'll use them as synonyms. And from an immature perspective, a lot of the work is done on Excel spreadsheets. Nothing against Excel, but we know it's not the most efficient when you're trying to collaborate with multiple parties at one time. But as you start to mature, right, and as you start to develop your foundation, we'll talk, on the next few slides about the pillars. And as you start to mature your pillars, you really move from a walk, jog, run kind of methodology here. So walking is, you're building your foundational program. You probably have a security team with limited capabilities or with limited resources. There's so much manual effort that goes into your program. You're manually collecting lists of vendors. You're manually having to talk to people to gather information about what vendors are doing. You probably have some technology that you're using. Maybe you have a survey tool that you send out, or maybe you're using email and other, other basic technologies, but you don't have a formal GRC, which is governance, risk, and compliance tools, such as Archer and other tools like that. And it's really a kind of a foundation. And then you move as you continue to mature, and your focus changes as you're moving that great step towards resiliency. I think at the end of the end goal of a good third-party risk management program is to feel like your business has a good understanding of your supply chain, and you can respond proactively and quickly to any changes in the market and in the supply chain. So you have redundancy built in, you have controls in place to identify where redundancy is needed. Managing that resiliency will limit the business impact if there's any impact to your supply chain. And then you're also automating. You're starting to automate. Maybe you have a GRC tool or something else that's another tool that's implemented to support risk management. And you're really starting to report metrics. You're starting to really utilize some of the data and present the data in ways that people who can make decisions are actually making decisions. And then as you become most mature, you have that holistic and dynamic risk management program. It's enterprise-wide. You have streamlined the reporting, and you're adaptive, so you can change and adjust the reporting as needed. And your organization is able to make informed decisions using the data that you have, and whether to continue to use a vendor because they're risky, or you make a business decision to build in resiliency because you've identified a risky single point of failure. And also you're able to respond to your audits. Everyone has to go through compliance audits and regulatory audits. But the more mature you become, the easier it is to gather evidence and streamline that and provide that readily available to those auditors when they come in.
Hey, Joe, we have a question.
Yeah.
So for customers who want to hit that run level of risk mitigation and management, but limited availability of data and the ability to share that data as it's coming in, how do you manage that and get a program started?
Well, I think I think there's probably a couple ways you can do that, but you'll hear me talk a lot about collaboration and working as partners with your vendors. And so we see this, and I saw this a lot at GE, where vendors just would not provide information, and whether it was secure and they wouldn't provide access, or we're not going to dig too much into HBOM and SBOMs on this call, but that's kind of the next great thing when it comes to supply chain risk management. But obviously, vendors hold that information very close. So it's about building trust with your third parties and know that it's kind of a joint responsibility to manage that risk. And so I think having that responsibility, be shared, I think will go a long way to help out there. And, I also look for, either industry organizations or, other things that will, allow you to share information. So we're not going to talk too much about Fortress on this call, but, Fortress has an information sharing library that we use, that we're trying to share, data and amongst, especially on the utility side, there's a model of sharing, cybersecurity information amongst the major utilities and critical infrastructure. And that's a way to help reduce the cost at an individual organization. So you look at your industry and say, do we have any industry groups that are trying to tackle that problem? And how can we leverage that to reduce the cost to individual organizations?
And I'll also add that a lot of the relationships between primes and subcontractors and their vendors, particularly as you get down into the third and fourth tier vendors, are very complicated and complex, and NDAs are your friends. So as you're working with your end users or customers and they're trying to hit that run speed, figure out who their vendors are, reach out to them and start trying to build relationships with them as best you can and get those NDAs in place. And they're typically a bit more willing to share that data.
I think one more question came in here about how do insurance companies consider risk management security in their policy considerations? That's a great question. And that's something that I haven't been as involved with the last couple of years that I've been at Fortress, but when I was at GE, we would use, or we saw that insurance companies were looking for cybersecurity rating scores as part of that insurance package. So if you look at tools like, BitSight, Security Scorecard, Risk Recon, Black Kite, they all provide, security risk ratings that have gone in and have affected, or you're allowed to use, or insurance companies use those scores to evaluate the cybersecurity risk of organizations. So, and Fortress has that capability as well. So, one of the key things is you start to mature your third-party risk program, not only to know what your third parties are doing, but also what are your customers and other entities viewing as your risk as well. So it's kind of a two-way street there. And, if you don't have a relationship, and we'll talk as we talk about building out the program and scalability, a lot of these risk rating providers will allow you to also look at yourself, and you can get an idea of what your digital or cyber footprint is and what others will see of you from the outside looking in without your and a lot of times it's even without your knowledge. So, keep that in mind as you start to mature your organization. So as I mentioned, we feel that there are really 6 pillars of a world-class TPRM program. And I've touched on some of these, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, but really it's your program focus. Are you looking at regulations versus risk, your policy, what your current program looks like? Scoping, what vendors and what organizations are in scope from your supply chain perspective. Accountability, how do you hold your suppliers accountable for their performance? Remediation, how do you remediate issues? And also how do you remediate and adjust your program and risk tolerance as you respond to incidents, but also as regulations and things change. We talked a little bit about resourcing. Resourcing is a key component. You don't have infinite resources. So how do we get the most bang for our buck? Scalability, automation, outsourcing, things along those lines, and also reacting to risk. So as we all know that the next supply chain attack is only a matter of time before it happens. They are happening constantly. Some we know, some we don't know yet. So how do you, as an organization, do you react to that risk, and what's your communication plan to react to that risk? So we'll hit on each of these as we go through the next couple slides.
And Joe, one of the questions submitted ahead of time is getting executive buy-in. So I know that was part of that slide, and then we'll address it on the resourcing slide, but just something to be mindful of. I'm sure that's getting leadership to buy into a risk management plan can be a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, it's almost like executive buy-in doesn't apply to just resourcing. It applies to every single pillar, right? Because without that executive buy-in, you're not going to have the support you need to develop and run a world-class program. And, one of the best ways to get that executive buy-in is to show them the value of the data that you're getting. So we'll talk a little bit about, how to use that data, but showing your executives the data you're gathering, how you can use it, how it makes your organization better by having that data. That will lead a long way to that executive buy-in. And there's never going to be like an infinite pocketbook where you can write a check and get everything you want. But showing them the value will make that conversation a lot easier and ensure that you're a line item in that budget going forward. So program focus, what do we care about? How do we maximize the value of our program? When you're first starting out, you're very compliance and regulatory focused. You're developing your baseline policy. You're maybe experimenting with which risk management framework to use. I know a lot of the folks on the call today, it's very NIST based, and CMMC is a good risk based framework to use. It's very important to settle on that, because all your stepping stones that you go through will be built on that. So as you move to a little bit more mature, you're moving from that compliance focus to risk focus. And what I mean by that is compliance focus is very check the box, right? You have to meet certain controls. Do we have it? Do we have it? Do we have it? Yeah. But risk focus is, how can we use that data, and what additional data can we gather that maybe is not, regulatory required right now, but we can use that for making business decisions and making business decisions based on risk. And so part of that is maturing your program stakeholders, letting them know and understand the focus and value of your program. And you might end up as an organization, and we saw this at GE, being a global manufacturing company, that we actually had to solve for multiple risk management frameworks depending on the business unit that we were diving into. And then as you're fully mature, right, your program is focused on the outcomes. So focus on the data and the use of the data, and how we're becoming a partner to our business, not just a security. A lot of times people view cybersecurity as kind of like a slowdown of our business, but you want to be viewed as really a partner and an enabler of your business. We talk about the zero trust model of, what used to be trust but verify, but really now is zero trust, is, for your critical suppliers and vendors, how do you partner with them to get the trust that you need from them, that they're safeguarding your data and, creating products and things that are secure for you to use. And then moving really from a reactive to a proactive approach.
And Joe, we have a question about effective ways to build or improve relationships between the primes and subcontractors and their vendors in order to build visibility and openness, and how primes should approach liability issues. So that is a very complicated answer. I will say that primes can approach liability issues just through the regulatory environment and making sure that they stay in compliance, which is a very dynamic environment that we'll address later in the presentation. But Joe, do you have anything to add about relationship building or ways to foster goodwill between these folks?
And also from a liability, some of it comes down to the contract risk as well, which is why I advanced a slide here, and really we talk about scoping of your program. But contract risk and the contracts that you put in place with your third parties will help shoulder some of that liability. But really the best way to have that relationship is have open dialogue and communication. I think in every aspect of our lives, I think communication is a very key thing to have. And it's no different when you're dealing with your third parties, right? And as much as they can know about you and your organization, how you're using them, and as much as you know about them, it only benefits everyone. So, a lot of times I encourage folks, especially, maybe not if you have thousands of suppliers, you're certainly not going to be able to do this for everyone. But, sit down and have conversations, especially with their critical suppliers. And you know what? If they know that they're a critical supplier for you, chances are they're going to, there's a lot of pride in that, so to speak, and they're going to, cherish that relationship. And we use that at GE a lot. We call them like our white glove suppliers, and they were like our most critical, that, hey, we were on first name basis with them. We visited them a couple of times a year. We had that ongoing relationship. And you know what? If there was a problem at that vendor, we knew about it before it hit the news. And so establishing and maintaining that relationship, having a relationship manager, that's more than just checking the box of, okay, do I have all your documents? It's really establishing that relationship with them. To go back on scoping, and I talked on a little bit of this, I'm also cognizant of time, and I love the questions, so we want to make sure we have time to answer those. But as you scope your vendors into your program, it's really about which vendors have the most impact to your business. And obviously, legacy, IT has been the first place to start because IT supports everything. But really, as you mature and you move to that run mentality, what vendors are you using enterprise-wide? What vendors are really important from a business resilience perspective? Are you addressing the cyber risk of those vendors as well? We hear like your operational or OT technology. Are you focusing on products? So it goes back to, how those vendors are supporting your overall business by providing products. Are you looking at product risks and the product impact to your organization? And then another aspect is, and this is another good way to show value, is you're doing due diligence on suppliers. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple ways we do that on the next slide. But as you mature, you build that due diligence into your supplier selection, so that when you send out RFPs, when you send out other items, you maybe have already shortlisted those based on some initial cyber due diligence that you've done. That allows you to have a much more focused RFP process, and it makes it a lot easier to eliminate, those folks that don't have a prayer of protecting your data. And some of these tools and techniques can become, it can become pretty apparent quickly, those that can and cannot protect your information. And the last thing you want to do is go through an RFP process and get to the end and realize you've got a high risk vendor that you're now introducing because you've selected them without the proper safeguards in place. Talk a little bit about remediation. When you're first starting out, people hear remediation, they think about, okay, I've assessed the cybersecurity controls at my vendor or my supplier. What do I do now? And some organizations just take it, look at it and say, hey, this is good information to have. But really, you're gonna, it takes a lot of resource time to gather that information. You need to have a plan of what you're going to do with it. So whether that's asking the supplier to remediate those findings or working with them to come up with a plan that's appropriate, as you start to mature, taking that information and ensuring that the vendors are not repeating those issues. Maybe we're starting to explore areas where what I'll call like collaborative remediation, because a lot of these suppliers, right, support not only your business but other companies and organizations that do very similar things. And what we're calling collaborative or joint remediation is like, how can you partner with some of your peer organizations to ensure that these vendors really are safeguarding that information? So it becomes kind of that collaborative partnership, not only with, in some case, maybe some competitor organizations, but really with the vendor or supplier as well, to be able to remediate and safeguard that information. But as you move and mature, you realize it sometimes, you're spend time remediating like low-hanging fruit that may not have such a large impact. And so as you mature, you really want to move to risk-based remediation. How do you focus the remediation to get the most bang for your buck? And then also incorporating, using the remediation process to incorporate feedback into your own program. Things you're potentially are holding your own vendors accountable for. Are we solving for these safeguards internally as well? But also, how can we adjust and change our program going forward as our risk tolerance changes? It's important to have that open review and that open dialogue for your own program to ensure that you keep it up to date and you're focusing on the right risks that matter to your organization.
Joe, one question came in about how do you handle client vulnerabilities driven by systems or black boxes that you can't access? Are there more specific strategies than just giving the client all the info you can?
Well, I think part of it is you have to be open and honest, right? So like I'll go back to establishing that relationship, based on your prior interactions. How much do you trust that supplier? Certainly asking them to share information. And I understand that whether it's the classification of where the data physically resides, or it's just, proprietary information, they don't want to share, all their secrets. But, what other mitigating controls can you identify from them that will help reduce, in your mind, some of that risk? And so I think part of it is having an open dialogue with our partners. I think gone are the day of like audits where, and before I worked at GE, I worked at, Deloitte for a number of years as well. And I look at people have like this thought when they think of audits of like, oh, they're just out trying to find findings and like catch me and stuff like that. But it's really not about that. It's really, our goal is to, we be open and honest and share the risk that you're trying to get an idea of how it's being mitigated, and have that open and honest dialogue. So whether it is they can share information, or maybe it's just you have to meet with, collaborate it with multiple people within their own organization, excuse me, whatever it might be, based on that organization is probably a tack you have to handle. So it's not always cut and dry, and a lot of it depends on the relationship and whether or not you trust that organization. But kind of tailor your thoughts towards, being open and sharing the risk that you're trying to remediate or mitigate, and talk about, what they can provide, and what they've done, and maybe what they've shown other organizations as well to help, to help give you the warm and, the confidence that they have, mitigated that issue. We talked a little bit about resourcing already, but obviously, part of this is the executive buy-in. The more the executives are bought in, the more likely you are to get the funding, or at least partial funding, that you ask for. It's important to continuously review your tool sets. So as you mature and as you use, you start moving from existing tools to maybe you're getting like workflow automation or some of the continuous monitoring or rapid risk rating tools, or, if you search in the marketplace, there's a lot of tools out there that support looking at your supply chain. It's important to continuously review those. So don't feel like you're ever locked in. The tools and your customers, or the tools and your suppliers from that perspective should constantly be looked at for the latest and greatest. And, don't be afraid to switch and move as you go through this as well. But really, as you mature, your team grows, but using the tools will help augment the need to have like a 100-person team. And so part of that goes back to, can we get with our industry to do some collaboration? Is there a way that we can collaborate amongst, the industry to do some of these, assessment or due diligence work, so that we don't have to all shoulder the bill? But also look at using tools like the rapid risk rating tools that I mentioned earlier are a good way to inexpensively at least take an initial look at your vendors and have an idea. And then again, it goes back to showing the value. And as you mature and you get more value out of your program, getting that executive buy-in will become a little bit easier. Scalability. I think everyone on the phone call probably has hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors. So realistically, you can't pick up the phone and call and do an in-depth audit or assessment or risk assessment of each vendor. So automation is key. So as you start your program, yes, you want to identify your critical vendors and start focusing on those. But your critical vendors, depending on how you classify them, are only a very small subset of your overall supply chain. So as you begin to scale and you look at ways that you can automate or outsource or augment the work that you're doing, focus on non-critical vendors and others that impact your supply chain. Start to move beyond vendors and focus on your important, business impact products, right? And then once you have that product strategy and you're looking at your products, what are the vendors that are supporting the products? It comes, that's another way to help identify your critical vendors. And then as you're fully mature, you're probably outsourcing a lot of the data gathering aspects, and whether that's rapid risk assessments or looking at your due diligence packages. And then your internal team is taking that data and interpreting it and using it to funnel to the right business folks that can make those decisions.
So, Joe, when you talked about scalability, can you talk a little bit more about the costs associated? That would be like a resourcing and scalability question.
So obviously there's, there are a lot of tools that are available. There's, a lot of resource costs that potentially could make this a very expensive program if you chose to make it expensive. But if you walked out and just hired, 15, 20 people to run your TPRM program, there's going to be a resource cost associated with that. The key, I think, is to leverage tools and technology to minimize some of those costs to maximize the coverage. So you're right. Resourcing and scalability really go together, and you got to find that right mix for your organization. So, look at and evaluate tools that are out there. Talk about, are there benefits to, we always found benefits at GE if we could sign multi-year deals. A lot of times there were discounts and stuff involved in that as well. So evaluate all aspects of that from a resource perspective, but really know what your end goal is and kind of, come up with your plan to get to that point. And you don't have to do everything overnight. It's very hard to overnight go from walk to run. It's usually a multi-year process. But as you're evaluating your program and setting it up, make sure you're focusing on the critical impact first, and then build from there. And then, build little by little. And, hopefully things change. And, as there's more competition for tools and technologies in that marketplace, that affects price and things too. So that's always something to keep in mind. So the last pillar here is really, reacting to risk. So we all know that the next supply chain attack is coming. So as an organization, are we prepared? I think most organizations will say, we have a response in place, but I don't know how prepared we are for it, because we know that those attack vectors could be coming from anywhere. It could be from a pipeline provider to, the people who print your bills to, a key technology that's now held ransom. So, as you mature your response to that organization or to that risk, move from being 100% detective to how can you be proactive. So using tools and technologies, using intel to be as proactive as possible, but be prepared. Know what's going to happen when something happens. Make sure you have a good resiliency plan in place, an incident response plan in place, your communication plan, and make sure you test it, right? Because we know you're going to have to use it at some point. Hopefully it won't be because of a catastrophic issue, but it's going to happen at some point. So just be prepared. As a former Boy Scout, I always say, like, be prepared is the motto, right? And this is, when you go into risk-based management, that's being prepared is the name of the game, right? So don't be shy about like plugging this in your organizations of, hey, it's going to happen. Like, let's make sure that we have the controls in place to respond to it. The other thing I'll talk about is, when you're looking at your vendor and supplier chain ecosystem, your third-party ecosystem, having a good understanding of who your suppliers are and what they do are key when it comes to reacting to the risk. Because the last thing you want to do is be in a situation where there is a supply chain attack and you're trying to identify if you're impacted at all and you have no idea. Because we all know our leadership, they want to know that immediately. And you're going to get that call at like midnight on a Friday night because there's been a supply chain attack, and they're going to want to know how impacted are we. And so when it comes to a third-party risk management program, as I mentioned, the first thing you should do is identify your supply chain ecosystem. Who are your key suppliers? What is their business impact? And have that documented. Because when it comes to that communication plan and that next supply chain attack, having that information is going to be crucial to how you react and how you respond and what you'll need to do. The last thing you want to do is be in almost panic mode where you're having to identify, are we even impacted? Do we even have this supplier? What is the supplier doing with us? Know that information can be gleaned from your TPRM program, and know that it's going to be information that's going to be needed at some point in the future. So before I hand it over to Andrea to talk a little bit about some of the regulations that we see upcoming, just kind of a recap here of, the 6 pillars of a world-class TPRM program. You got to have a great focus. You need to know what your scope is, which third parties are you evaluating, which third parties are you focused on. Know what to do with issues that are identified, how you adjust your program, how you adjust your relationship with the suppliers. Understand your resource constraints. How can you get the most value for your investment? How to get that executive level buy-in. Focus on scalability. You're always going to have suppliers that you just don't have resources to cover. What can you do to reduce the risk of those suppliers as well? And then be prepared to react to the risk. Know who your suppliers are and what they're providing for your organization. But then more importantly, when the next attack happens, know how you're going to respond. So if you don't have that incident response in place, do that immediately, because it's only a matter of time. I guess, Andrea, I'll hand it over to you a little bit about why the DoD feels that this is as important.
Right. Yeah, this is the part everybody came for today, is the discussion on DoD SCRIM regulations. So everyone knows that the regulatory environment is dynamic. It is ever changing and ever shifting, which causes a lot of frustration for everybody involved. So the primes are concerned about their own responsibilities, and now they're also responsible for their subcontractors' behavior as well as vendors. And you have a lot of folks who aren't even really fully understanding how to be compliant. So it's no surprise then that the most questions that we received in advance of the webinar also are tied to the regulatory environment. So I'll sort of bounce back and forth between the slide and answering questions. But one of the best things an organization can do is be proactive and mindful of their current cyber hygiene practices, understand where the deltas exist and what you need to do to bridge the gap. So doing an internal audit, doing an assessment, and being really honest with yourself. So many of these programs have relied on self-attestation programs or self-attestation models where they would do an internal survey. We also know that vendors and prime contractors have been incentivized to sort of look the other way and hope for the best. On the commercial side, for critical infrastructure, they have the ability to leverage fines of up to $1 million per day per asset found to be inviolate. Now, on the government side, both fortunately and unfortunately, there is not a similar fine structure. However, the Department of Justice has been very clear about their intention to use the False Claims Act and level treble damages against primes and being responsible for their subs. And so nobody wants to get caught red-handed of being inviolate of any of these regulations, but it's tough to understand how to be in compliance. So I've got about 13 listed here, but it's really going to be up to the responsibility of the organization to understand which of these regulations fall squarely right across the plate for them that they need to be the most mindful of and aware of, and then which one they need to just stay familiar with, particularly as they affect further down the chain within the contracting process. So the key is being proactive in risk management, but then also understanding the reactive nature of the government in staying responsive to these highly sophisticated and dynamic threat environment and the way that bad actors are sort of exploiting the vulnerabilities as they find them. We've seen that there is, ransomware as a service, and cyber attacks are becoming professional structures in other countries. So it's not something that it's just a few bad actors who are acting independently. These are really broad and nation state attacks. So one of the questions that we received is there anything that the U.S. government and perhaps Commerce Department or non-government organizations such as the NDIA can do to make it easier for businesses to manage third-party risk? So it seems like this is an adversarial relationship between the government and the prime contractors and vendors and those sorts of things, but it is definitely not. Jen Easterly and then later President Biden have been very clear about the need for public and private partnerships. So as the government rolls out additional regulations or gets more stringent in the existing regulatory environment, it's going to be up to the private sector to really step up and not only remain compliant, but assist smaller vendors and subcontractors, particularly your small businesses, with gaining and maintaining compliance. I would also recommend, well, let me get to the question first. First, new regulations and directives are always coming down the pike. So focusing squarely on securing the supply chain, what's the best way to stay ahead and be proactive rather than being reactive? I wish there was a way that we had a crystal ball and you could just always be proactive. Like I said, unfortunately, these attacks and vulnerability exploits are becoming far more sophisticated than we've seen in the past, which means that the regulatory environment doesn't have much choice but to be reactive. But that also means that as a user or as a business operator, it's your responsibility to stay nimble. So don't get too heads down in following one regulatory mandate to the T and then refusing to budge from that. Just understanding that they can and will change as this evolves, and then also staying active in those communities. So CMMC is, and that's going to be the next question, but CMMC is pretty popular for how much it's changed since 1.0 was announced and the training was provided to the folks who want to be early adopters of this control environment. And so just joining the communities, attending the town halls, staying up to date on best practices. So not just what's prescribed by the regulation itself, but with just a standard best practice within the industry, that's going to really give you a leg up. So then you should find, again, with CMMC, that your cyber hygiene controls that are already in place may actually outpace the regulatory environment. And then the other thing to understand is that some of these regulations very specifically proscribe what compliance looks like. So the DOTI 5000.90 specifically spells out the need for a dashboard that fully illuminates the supply chain for continuous monitoring of risk management. There's not much leeway there. It's pretty easy to understand exactly what the government is trying to say and what they want you to do and how you can demonstrate compliance. Now, CMMC, on the other hand, when you go from 1.0 to 2.0, initially it was 5 maturity levels with very stringent and defined cyber hygiene practices. And now 2.0 has evolved into a system that relies more heavily on markings and distribution statements and compliance within everybody in the environment to really understand what is potentially vulnerable information. So, they talked a lot about FCI and CUI and the distinctions between those. And then you've seen more and more contractors, so government contracting agencies and the primes and subs and everyone are just getting more and more conservative in their handling of information. This is great because it hopefully means a more secure environment, but it can create a bunch of additional challenges and roadblocks as you move through and try to navigate that. And also, anytime you slow down the pass-through of information from the government to a contractor, it makes the whole project more expensive and more time-consuming. And then finally, I'll say just understanding, like I said, which relevant regulations you've got and then which ones are likely to influence current and future projects. It's very difficult to know, exactly where everything's going to fall, but work closely with your contracting officer and your compliance team. Everybody is working on this together to support what you need to get the job done. We just had a question asking how to handle FedRAMP compliance for the SMB for 2022. The cost is hitting the potential clients and us as well. So that, I think, and Joe, I'll let you chime in on this as well, but FedRAMP in particular is a lengthy and expensive process. So that goes back into those pillars of, resourcing, making sure that the resourcing is there, making sure that these sort of security practices are considering more than just an afterthought or line item on the internal budgets, getting executive buy-in, making sure that the folks in the C-suite really understand the negative impact or ripples of business impact that you can have for not being compliant, particularly when you're considering FedRAMP. And then, Joe, do you want to hand? FedRAMP is such a tricky and difficult.
Yeah, I think a good way to view it is FedRAMP is not just like a one-time point in time thing. Right. It's more of a continuous program, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something that will be with you for a while. So to your point, that really needs to be a line item in the budget. And I can understand from a small business perspective, the costs are a lot more impactful than maybe a large organization. But, part of that is, understanding that one way to handle it is maybe it's more of a journey than like an overnight success when it comes to that. And maybe it'll take time to grow and get that input. So when FedRAMP first came out, I actually worked on like an implementation team at my company, and it was, writing some of the documents and other things were it was very labor intensive and took time. And then, the audits can be costly, but, making sure you find the right partners to help support you as well. And your sponsoring organization, maybe they have some tips and tricks that they could use as well to help support you. Maybe they have other similar companies that could help you get started and leverage some of that information that they have, or some of the templates, or some of just their lessons learned, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that, with the way the regulations changed or going through that process of FedRAMP, understanding that the efforts that you put into securing your supply chain or your internal, cyber environment, none of those are wasted. It's always going to make a more secure environment for you. It's going to make a more secure environment for your government customer. So I know that sometimes it can be a bit frustrating as you try to hit all of those wickets and be compliant, and then the regulatory environment might shift and change. And personally, I was one of the first registered professionals for CMMC, and Fortress was one of the first registered provider organizations, and then the model changed. Mm-hmm. But it all creates a better understanding of the regulatory environment, and then just understanding how to enforce and adhere to those regulations in the spirit in which they were intended, not necessarily, to the letter, because it's always going to change. There's nothing that we can do about it. And I wish that, like I said, that there was some sort of a crystal ball where you could anticipate when the government was going to release new and more stringent practices. But doing the best you can to be as compliant as you can, or even, like I said, outpacing what the regulatory environment needs or announces that they need in order to ensure that your program is protected. I think that's going to be the best. That's going to be the best advice that we can offer. And that, I would love to keep talking all day about government regulations, but it's part of your handout. So if you need to reflect back on that, you're welcome to. So we got a lot of great questions throughout the presentation, but we'll also, just say thank you and then open it up to any additional questions that you may have. You can always reach out to me and Joe at Fortress as well, or through the NTSA. if you have follow-up questions, sometimes it's a bit like drinking out of a fire hose and it takes a minute to really process everything you've heard. So we're always happy to have follow-up conversations as well. All right, I see a lot of silence in the Q&A box, which means that we did a great job. We answered everything. All right, Admiral Rob, I'm going to turn it back over to you because it looks like everybody's quiet here.
Okay, well, thanks, and Andrea and John, I appreciate your time. That was a great tutorial on a very complicated subject, and I think that I just want to emphasize to those online that this is recorded and it's available. So even if folks didn't register up front, they can still go back and register and get this great content. So I know from the NTSA point of view and the NDIA point of view, the CMMC piece of this has been very frustrating. We're getting a lot of feedback from especially small businesses, what is going on. And then we had this big reset. Unfortunately, and Andrea did a great job of saying where we are currently, but it is still being worked on. So when I ask our policy shop about what's the best focus at this point, they just keep saying focus on the NIST standards, and CMMC won't, will be based on that anyway. So and I think that NDIA is really dedicated to pushing back and ensuring that there's enough time and space to get whatever they come up with in 2.0 to go into action. So I appreciate all of that. For all of you, the questions were terrific, and if you have others, you can send them in to me at jrob@ntsa.org, and we have connectivity with the speakers, and we also have the registration list, so we can continue this dialogue as we go. I also want to focus the audience on the fact that NDIA has CMMC webinars, which are really insightful, and they've had roundtables to try to collect views from the field about concerns. And so I think that, stay tuned and stay plugged into our ecosystem here, and we'll work through CMMC stuff and cybersecurity as we go. So I just want to focus your attention on the next webinar. It's going to be on the 27th of April at 11 Eastern, where the topic's going to be improving human performance in the future. So this goes back to a mega theme we have at ITSEC for focusing on how we can address individual human performance and measurement, and it should be a great event. So with that, I thank everyone for being here. I thank the speakers, and I want to thank Renee Despot, who's our producer today, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Yep.